across the world, billions of people are brought up believing in stories that, if you strip away tradition and emotion, start to sound deeply strange when said out loud. Ideas that seem normal inside a sacred book or a temple suddenly feel absurd when you hear them in a living room or on a bus. And yet, these beliefs continue, not just because people are unintelligent. That's not what this is about. It's because humans are social, emotional, and extremely good at making the bizarre feel normal if enough people agree on it. Let's start with something familiar, the idea that a cracker can literally turn into a person's flesh. In Catholicism, the Eucharist isn't just symbolic. According to official doctrine, and yes, this is the formal position of the Church, during Mass, the bread and wine physically become the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. This belief is called transubstantiation. Millions of people genuinely believe that through a prayer, molecules in bread change into human flesh, though it still looks, tastes, and chemically tests like a cracker. That's the claim. Now, if someone walked into a dinner party and said their snack had transformed into human muscle tissue, you'd call for help. But dress it in ritual and centuries of repetition, and somehow it's sacred. There's a kind of mental shortcut here, a suspension of normal reasoning, not because people are trying to be illogical, but because they've been trained to override their own doubt. It's not about proof anymore. It's about obedience, loyalty, and identity. This kind of thinking doesn't stay in churches. It shows up in politics, medicine, even economics. When beliefs stop requiring evidence, they start demanding submission. Take the idea that a man once lived inside a giant fish, not as a metaphor, but as an actual event in history. The story of Jonah being swallowed by a great fish, often interpreted as a whale, and surviving 3 days in its stomach, is still accepted as literal truth in many conservative religious circles. Again, not as myth or poetry, but as biology. Never mind that whales can't swallow something the size of a grown man without choking, or that stomach acid would dissolve someone within hours, or that there's no trace of such an event ever happening. The story holds up in the minds of believers because it's not allowed to be questioned. And this is where absurdity becomes dangerous. Once people accept that impossible things can happen just because they're written down, they become vulnerable to manipulation. You don't need to dig far to see how these beliefs affect real decisions. When religious schools teach children that dinosaurs lived alongside humans or that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, they're not just offering an alternative worldview. They're cutting off those children from science, logic, and even reality itself. And yet, there's a strange comfort in these ideas. They offer certainty in a confusing world. They turn randomness into design, suffering into a test, and death into a doorway. That's why they stick. But some beliefs are so extreme, so obviously irrational, that they reveal just how far people will go to preserve an illusion. In India, there's a sect of people who believe that if they never cut their hair, they'll grow closer to God. In practice, it's harmless, but it shows how ritual, no matter how arbitrary, becomes sacred when attached to fear or hope. In the Philippines, some believers nail themselves to wooden crosses every Easter to reenact the suffering of Christ. They do it publicly, in full view, bleeding and in pain. Authorities usually stand by. Why? Because when pain is framed as devotion, it stops looking like self-harm. This isn't isolated. In Ethiopia, there's a tradition in which believers whip themselves to cleanse sins. In parts of Brazil, there are exorcisms where people convulse and scream to release demons. These rituals all stem from the same idea, that your body is a battleground for invisible forces. Strip away the context and it sounds indistinguishable from delusion. But the thing is, most of these people aren't mentally ill. They're perfectly functional in daily life. The delusion isn't individual, it's social. It's institutionalized. Once a belief is shared by enough people, it stops needing proof. That's the trick. One of the most disturbing examples of this can be found in Uganda, where a religious cult called the Movement for the Restoration of the Ten Commandments convinced hundreds of people to prepare for the apocalypse. When it didn't arrive, the leaders orchestrated a mass killing, burning more than 700 followers alive in a church. This happened in the year 2000. Not ancient history, not myth, real people, real beliefs, real consequences. But you don't need a mass killing to see the damage. Consider faith healing. Across the US, there are churches that teach followers to reject medicine in favor of prayer. Children have died because their parents believed disease was caused by sin, not bacteria. In their eyes, going to the hospital isn't just a mistake, it's a betrayal of God. And because religious freedom is deeply protected, many of these parents face no punishment. That's how far religious belief can go. It can override instinct, deny evidence, and even justify the death of your own child. This isn't about being unkind. Most religious people are trying to do what they believe is right. But that's the problem. When you believe the rules come from a divine source, you stop asking whether the rules make sense. And that's how absurdity takes root. And once it takes root, it grows in every direction. Beliefs about sex, diet, clothing, money, women, children, even who you're allowed to speak to, all dictated by rules written by people who lived in deserts thousands of years ago. Take, for example, the idea that touching a woman during her period makes you spiritually unclean. This isn't just an ancient taboo buried in a dusty book. In some Orthodox Jewish communities today, women are required to sleep in separate beds and avoid physical contact with their husbands during menstruation. Some must even bathe in a ritual pool before they can touch anyone again. In ultra-conservative Hindu sects, menstruating women aren't allowed to enter temples, kitchens, or even their own homes in some cases. They're sent to huts or left isolated for days. All because of a superstition that treats a basic biological function as something shameful or impure. The irony? These same traditions will often exalt motherhood and fertility as divine blessings. Yet they stigmatize the very thing that makes fertility possible. That contradiction isn't a bug in the system. It is the system. Religious beliefs don't need to be consistent, they just need to be followed. And when they conflict with reason, reason usually loses. One of the clearest examples is in the idea of karma, a belief popular in Hinduism, Buddhism, and the New Age world. At first glance, it seems harmless, even noble. You do good, good comes back to you. Simple enough. But in practice, karma turns into a moral accounting system that punishes people for being poor, disabled, or abused. Because if bad things happen to you, it must be the result of something you did in a past life. That idea has been used to justify everything from caste discrimination to child neglect. In some circles, helping a suffering person is discouraged because you'd be interfering with their karma, their lesson. And so you get a system where victims are blamed and compassion is optional. In Thailand, for instance, thousands of people worship a former king as an actual god, not metaphorically, literally, a god. Statues of him are dressed, fed, and worshipped. He's believed to protect those who honor him and curse those who don't. When people believe their luck, health, or survival depends on keeping a dead monarch happy, they're not thinking anymore. They're managing fear. And fear is a powerful motivator. It's how cults are built, not with reasoned arguments, but with threats of hell, dishonor, or divine punishment. And the worst part is, you don't even need a god to create that fear. Look at Scientology. Its belief system doesn't revolve around traditional deities, but it still includes an entire mythology involving invisible alien souls called thetans, implanted into humans by an intergalactic warlord named Xenu. Yes, this is real. This is the core doctrine behind one of the wealthiest and most secretive organizations in the world. To outsiders, it sounds like science fiction, but to believers, many of whom pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to advance, spiritually, it's treated as sacred truth. Questioning it isn't just discouraged, it's punished. There are ex-members who've been stalked, harassed, and even sued for speaking out. Why? Because the truth, once exposed, is fragile. All absurd beliefs are, but absurdity isn't always so theatrical. Sometimes it's quietly embedded in everyday life. Think about the belief that you need to cut off a piece of a baby boy's genitals to make him clean in the eyes of God. Circumcision is treated as routine in some cultures, even in countries with no strong religious pressure, but its roots are explicitly religious, a covenant with a deity, a lifelong, irreversible act performed on someone who can't consent. The arguments have shifted over time, from religious obedience to hygiene to tradition, but none of them fully address the fact that we're still letting ancient scripture dictate what we do to a newborn's body. And again, it's normalized, which is the real danger. Because once absurdity becomes normalized, it becomes invisible. You might not think of birthday parties as religious, but in Jehovah's Witness communities, they're banned. So are blood transfusions, saluting the flag, and celebrating national holidays, not because they're harmful, but because they're seen as disrespectful to God. A child with leukemia may be denied life-saving treatment because a group of men in New York decided it's against Scripture to receive blood, not even synthetic blood, any blood. This isn't an abstraction. Kids have died over this. And then there's the prosperity gospel, a modern form of Christianity that teaches wealth is a sign of divine favor. The richer you are, the more blessed you must be. Pastors fly around in private jets, while their followers empty their savings hoping for miracles. It's religion as pyramid scheme, and still, people keep giving, not because they're greedy, but because they've been taught that questioning is sinful, that faith means trusting the con artist, not your own instincts, as that's how absurdity survives. It hides inside guilt, shame, ritual, and fear. It builds walls against curiosity. It labels doubt as weakness. And it convinces people that their own suffering is part of a divine plan. But if we're honest, brutally honest, most religious beliefs aren't based on reality. They're based on emotion, on the need for meaning, for control, for belonging. They offer answers to questions that science can't yet solve, or doesn't solve in a comforting way. That doesn't make them true, it just makes them effective. We've created gods in our own image, then told ourselves those gods created us. We've taken the unknowable and given it a name, a beard, a book, a list of rules. And then we've spent thousands of years punishing anyone who didn't agree with it. When you step back and really look at it, not with anger, but with clarity, it's obvious that these beliefs aren't just wrong, they're unnecessary. We don't need invisible punishers to know that murder is bad. We don't need sacred texts to tell us to help the poor. We don't need sky gods to explain lightning or disease. We have empathy. We have reason. We have evidence. But more than anything, we have the right to say, this doesn't make sense. And the more people who say that out loud, the fewer children will grow up afraid of imaginary threats. The fewer women will be shamed for being human. The fewer people will die because someone thought faith was more important than fact. And maybe, just maybe, we can start building a world where absurdity doesn't hide behind holiness. One of the strange things about religion is how often it demands certainty in areas where uncertainty is just honest. What happens after we die, no one knows, but instead of sitting with that discomfort, religions invent precise answers. Heaven, hell, reincarnation, paradise, judgment day, each more specific than the last, each claiming exclusive truth. In Islam, the belief that martyrs receive 72 virgins in the afterlife has been used and abused to justify acts of terrorism. It's not just metaphorical, it's taught in some interpretations as a literal reward system. Kill in God's name and receive eternal pleasure. That's not spirituality, that's cosmic bribery. And when you think about it, what kind of moral system rewards killing with sex? What kind of God creates a heaven where the prize for obedience is ownership of other human beings? The very concept is built on outdated ideas about women, purity, and possession, but it's not just Islam. In Mormonism, believers are told that if they follow the right rules, including giving 10% of their income to the church for life, they can one day become gods of their own planets. That's the actual doctrine. Human beings can become divine, rule over worlds, and populate them with spirit children. The universe, according to Mormon theology, is essentially a multi-level marketing scheme, with deities at the top and endless followers below. And if that sounds too outlandish to be true, that's only because you're hearing it in plain English outside a temple. Inside, it's sacred. Outside, it's science fiction. Even reincarnation, often seen as gentle or spiritual, carries some deeply questionable baggage. In communities where this belief dominates, people born with disabilities are sometimes seen as being punished for mistakes in previous lives. Victims of rape or war might be told they chose this life to balance karma. It's not always meant to be cruel, but it ends up being cruel. Because if everything is part of a divine plan, then nothing is unjust. No one is truly a victim. And the logical conclusion is terrifying. Suffering isn't something to fix. It's something to accept. That idea has paralyzed change for centuries. The caste system in India, rooted in religious doctrine, the belief that some people are born lower and must accept a life of servitude to purify their souls. It's been outlawed legally, but socially, it still persists. And the justification again is spiritual. You were born poor or sick or marginalized because that's what you earned in another life. Not because of systems or luck or injustice, but because of karma. It's a perfect excuse to do nothing. But religious absurdity isn't always about elaborate stories. Sometimes it's about rules. Strange, obsessive, hyper-specific rules about what to eat, what to wear, where to stand, and what to say. In Jainism, some monks wear masks over their mouths at all times, not because of illness, but to avoid accidentally killing microscopic life forms by breathing them in. Others sweep the ground before every step to avoid crushing insects. At first glance, it's about non-violence, but taken to the extreme, it becomes performative, a theater of purity that focuses more on visible rituals than actual impact. Meanwhile, these same belief systems may have nothing to say about larger structural violence, like poverty, discrimination, or authoritarianism, because the focus isn't on changing the world, it's on following the rules. In Orthodox Judaism, there are strict regulations on what counts as work during the Sabbath, including not flipping light switches, tearing toilet paper, or carrying keys in public. Whole communities have invented complicated loopholes just to comply. People walk through hallways with cords around their waists to symbolically carry objects they're not supposed to hold. Others hire non-Jews called Shabbos goys to press elevator buttons for them. It's not about morality, it's about legalism, technical obedience, understandably, and overcome. And when you look at it that way, it's not that different from software code. Except instead of building apps, you're trying to hack your way into divine favor. The absurdity isn't always in the belief itself. It's in how much energy, time, and guilt people invest into these tiny, arbitrary details while ignoring the bigger questions, like why any omniscient being would care what fabric you wear, or how often you pray, or what direction you face when you do it. In Islam, praying 5 times a day toward Mecca is one of the 5 pillars. Miss a prayer and you're sinning. Pray in the wrong direction, it might not count. There are books upon books of legal discussion just on how to face correctly when you're on a plane. And yet, this same system often has almost nothing to say about democratic rights, mental health, or scientific progress, because those aren't priorities in the afterlife economy. What matters isn't whether you made the world better. What matters is whether you followed the rules. And that's where so many religious systems break down. They ask us to be obedient, not curious, faithful, not questioning, devout, not honest. Which brings us to one of the most persistent and dangerous ideas in all of religion, that doubt is a flaw. In nearly every major religion, doubt is painted as weakness, or worse, as sin. People are told that asking questions shows a lack of faith, that wanting evidence is prideful, that logic is the enemy of belief. And so, entire generations are taught to ignore their own minds, to treat their deepest questions as moral failings, to equate uncertainty with evil. But here's the truth. Doubt isn't weakness. It's awareness. It's the voice inside that says, this doesn't add up. It's the pause before blindly accepting authority. It's the crack in the wall where light gets in. And if a belief system can't survive doubt, it doesn't deserve to survive. Absurd beliefs don't survive because they're convincing. They survive because they're taught early. Most people don't choose their religion after comparing options like they're buying a phone. They inherit it, like a last name or a passport. And the earlier a belief is taught, the deeper it sinks. Before logic is even fully formed, the idea is already there. This is the truth. Everything else is false. It's not a fair fight. Belief gets a head start. Doubt has to catch up. And the brain adjusts. It builds neural shortcuts around these beliefs, like a tree growing around a fence. Over time, the fence becomes invisible, part of the structure. But it was never natural. It was installed. Psychologists call this belief perseverance. Once an idea is emotionally anchored, especially if it's tied to your family, your identity, your community, it becomes almost immune to logic. Facts bounce off. Contradictions get rationalized away. And if you try to leave, you don't just lose a belief, you risk losing everything. In tightly knit religious groups, leaving the faith often means losing your family, your job, your reputation. Some ex-believers are disowned, others are excommunicated. In extreme cases, they're threatened, stalked, or attacked. In Islam, apostasy, the act of leaving the religion, is punishable by death in some countries. Even in places without legal penalties, the social pressure is intense. Former believers are often shunned, harassed, or labeled immoral. Not because they did anything wrong, but because they stopped pretending to believe. This fear is what keeps many people in line. Not faith, not love, fear. And the irony is, for a system that claims to hold ultimate truth, religion is often terrified of open inquiry. Why else would it need to threaten people for asking questions? Why else would it teach children that doubt is dangerous? Why else would it rewrite history, censor science, and ban books? A confident idea doesn't need protection. A fragile one does. And yet, religions continue. Not just because of fear, but because they offer something real. Community. Human beings are wired to belong. We want to feel part of something bigger. Religion delivers that. It gives people rituals, holidays, structure, support. And that's what makes it so hard to criticize. Because if you challenge the beliefs, people think you're attacking their families, their culture, their lives. But belief and belonging aren't the same. You can love your community and still question the rules. You can cherish tradition without pretending the mythology is true. And when you separate the social function from the supernatural claims, things become clearer. Because at the heart of most religions are ideas we don't need a God to value. Kindness, honesty, justice, compassion. These aren't religious ideas, they're human ones. They existed long before sacred texts. They evolve with us. They adapt to new information. They grow stronger when tested. But religious dogma, it freezes time. It locks morality to ancient codes that can't change, even when the world does. That's why absurd beliefs persist, because updating them would mean admitting they're not eternal. And if one piece of the system is wrong, the whole thing becomes vulnerable. That's the real fear, not hell, not divine judgment, but collapse. Because religion isn't just a story, it's scaffolding for identity, power, control. In many countries, religious leaders aren't just spiritual guides. They're politicians, business owners, gatekeepers of marriage, education, and law. They have real power, and power resists change. So even when a belief is obviously absurd, like snakes talking or angels keeping score or women being created from a rib, it's not enough to point it out. There are systems invested in preserving the illusion, and breaking out of that illusion takes more than logic. It takes courage. Not just to see the truth, but to say it out loud. That's why these conversations matter. Not to mock, not to belittle, but to invite people to think, to ask, to reconsider what they've been told. To reclaim their right to say this doesn't make sense, and that's okay. Because once you stop needing everything to make sense, you're free to find out what actually does. There's a strange freedom in admitting you don't have all the answers, in letting go of the need to explain everything with a higher power, in realizing that I don't know is not a weakness, it's a starting point. Religious belief often pretends to fill every gap. It wraps up mystery in neat little boxes, angels, demons, divine plans, and calls that knowledge. But real understanding doesn't come from declaring certainty. It comes from facing uncertainty and exploring it honestly. That's how science works. That's how philosophy works. That's how human progress works. But religion, at its most rigid, says, stop there. Don't ask. Don't dig. Don't think too much. Believe and be quiet. And if that belief involves swallowing ideas that defy biology, physics, logic, or even basic compassion, so be it. That's how you end up with people who think the earth is flat, because the Bible hints at it. Or that illnesses are caused by demons. Or that an invisible man watches you masturbate, but needs a blood sacrifice to forgive you for it. These aren't fringe ideas. They're taught, they're defended, they're funded. And the absurdity doesn't stop at the individual level. Whole governments are shaped by these beliefs. In the United States, policies on reproductive rights are often driven by interpretations of ancient scripture. In parts of Africa, anti-gay laws are justified using verses from the Old Testament. In some Islamic countries, women still can't drive, vote, or show their hair in public, all in the name of modesty, purity, or submission to God. These rules don't emerge from evidence. They survive because questioning them is seen as heresy. But heresy is just another word for thinking clearly. When you strip away the fear, the ritual, the social pressure, what's left? Usually not much. Some vague metaphors, moral suggestions, and origin myths that crumble under basic scrutiny. And yet, most people don't walk away. Because belief isn't just intellectual. It's emotional. It's tied to love, memory, family, death. It gets into your bones. That's why ridicule doesn't work. That's why facts alone aren't enough. What does work is honesty, not just with others, but with yourself. If something sounds absurd when you say it out loud, don't ignore that instinct. If the rules seem arbitrary, cruel, or contradictory, don't explain them away. If you've been told your doubts are evil, ask why that would even need to be true. Because if your beliefs are strong, they should survive examination, and if they don't, what exactly are you holding on to? This isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about inviting a better question. What kind of world could we build if we stopped being afraid of asking? What kind of ethics could we create if we weren't bound to ancient codes? What kind of communities could we form if we let go of superstition and held on to reason, compassion, and shared humanity? That world wouldn't be perfect, but it would be real, and it would be ours. No invisible strings, no ancient threats, just people, thinking, evolving, building something better, one question at a time.